I think the potential to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
Life 2.0.
Dr. Andrew Campbell is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Sydney. He is also the founder and director of Prometheus, which looks squarely at technology and well-being. He's also an outspoken researcher in the area of mental health, the ideal interviewee when it comes to the idea of technology and our well-being. He joins me now. Welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where is the phone as you go to sleep? Where is your phone?
It's usually about 30 centimetres from my head.
Oh, how do you cope with that?
No, I switch it off. I leave it there. Quite frankly, I think everybody should try and do that, but it charges next to me. And maybe that's not a good thing because we now know that you think about it. You actually think about it if it's in proximity. So good to keep tech out of the room.
Well, I know that particularly working now for ABC, as a news story starts to simmer as I go to bed, it may well come to the boil in the middle of the night, and I cannot help but look at my phone if I do wake 3 or 4 o'clock. How come you don't have that impulse?
It's over time, we've actually learnt two things. So from a personal level, I really can't bear to touch my phone anymore. It's one of those things that I see as just a tool for my job and a little bit of my social life. But that's because over time, the habits changed. I've actually learnt that it's really an obsession rather than an addiction, and we have to build it into our lives as such, as something that's useful. But a lot of people don't get to that stage, and that's the problem. What
is the difference between an obsession and an addiction?
Well, one of the things we've learnt recently in the field of cyberpsychology, which is actually what we do at Sydney University, I heard you mention Prometheus before. We've actually changed that to cyberpsychology now, Cyberpsychology Research Group. What we look at is we look at how human beings actually enter into a behaviour and stay fixated on it or move past it. So it's kind of like liking your favourite TV show. You're obsessed, you want to binge watch it, but then after a while you get tired and you go, I can't think about it anymore, and it obsesses you for a while to redo the plot in your head, try and figure it out. But you get exhausted after a while, and that's what we're finding is with technology, we're starting to burn out a little bit on it. And so people are moving into, what do I actually need it for? And when it's an addiction, to answer that part of the question, is when you really can't find a way to do anything else but just be on that phone.
I think I've worked out the analogy. It seems to me that an obsession is an intense honeymoon period, whereas an addiction is a toxic codependency.
Exactly. That's beautifully put.
So how do you shake an addiction?
Well, when it comes down to tech addictions, the studies we've done so far are mostly around video gaming and social network. They're the two that we've sort of looked at. And then, of course, online gambling and pornography as well. They fall into the category. But we see gambling and pornography as extensions of those offline behaviours. So what we do when it comes to an addiction is we actually sort of regress. We look at what was it that you were doing before this all started. We start looking at the behaviours you had that may have indicated that you had problems before you started into the addictive behaviour with the technology. So in other words, what we see is that tech addiction, whether it be gaming or gambling, whatever you want to call it, is normally a mask for something else. We find that there's usually either behavioural problems, mental health problems, financial, social. There's usually lots of layers underneath it. So we address the problem by going to those layers rather than the tech addiction itself.
Has the desire in humans changed, turning to the likes of online gaming and gambling, or has the appetite always been there, but the stimuli have changed?
Yeah, they have. One of the things we know now is how to trigger rewards faster in the brain with technology. Social media is a very good example. The like button. Everybody checks for likes or hearts or emojis. This is a wonderful social dopamine release response that we get, and we feel good about ourselves. And the more we see it, the more we feel we're loved or liked. With technology, we can connect to wider groups of people to get that response. And so you're constantly seeking affirmation, and that's part of the addiction response, or it's the beginning part. And we see that particularly with younger people who have yet to control how their emotions work. to what sometimes is faceless feedback, or most of the time is faceless feedback. They couldn't possibly know all these people, so you don't know the sincerity behind it. But over time, we noticed that really it doesn't add to our lives. And then it's about, we actually notice, to use the social media analogy again, that we shrink our social media use to people we actually start to know and care about, and issues we start to know and care about. So in our teenage years, massive groups, 400, 500, 6,000 friends. And as we get into our 30s and 40s, they start to decrease.
Friends have real names and faces and become more meaningful relationship.
Correct. Yeah.
So how do you imagine that you have a teen who is in that maelstrom of like and affirmation and finding it hard to break? It possibly has moved from obsession to addiction. How do you start to undo that addiction?
With teens, it is very tough. What I can tell all parents listening tonight is that there is always a way, but it's about putting priorities in place and getting them to understand that these are transient behaviours that they're going through, and that they won't matter when they get through school, when they get to uni, TAFE, their jobs. It all changes over time. The problem is being stuck in the moment. And that's the hard part. So we've got to look at what are the behaviours that are affecting others, and getting them to understand empathy, getting them to understand social responsibility, getting to understand health and wellness for themselves. So the common people I've seen when I was practicing some years ago would be too many hours on YouTube, too many hours playing video games, too many times that they want to message each other in the middle of the night. These are things that can wait. So teaching that waiting is its own reward is something that's very hard to do, but something we need to instill. The short answer, I know I'm being long-winded here, is that we have to start very young. We've learnt that when teenagers are at that point of being stuck down with the problem, that essentially we're going to be working much harder at undoing it than if we started teaching them about digital citizenship and digital behaviours in their very formative years, very early years.
9:18, you're with David Astle on ABC Evening. My guest is Dr. Andrew Campbell, who's a senior lecturer in psychology and cyberpsychology, as you've just heard, that whole idea of technology and mental health, the interface between those two. I would imagine he was about a 3-year-old boy watching his mother's phone. It would have seemed like a small animation that he was watching. To say that he was mesmerised is to put it mildly. His behaviour changed completely. He was being obstreperous, I must admit, at the table, and his mother, most likely as a last resort, went for the screen as a distraction. I could completely empathise with her decision. However, is there a kind of real danger of immersing children too young into screen life?
This has been a very hot topic in the news just this month, actually. Screen time, just to answer the question in two parts, screen time is actually something that formulated in the late 1940s when television was coming about. So we were very worried that TVs were going to turn us into zombies. So the issue is not so much about the time in front of the screen, although we were worried about frequencies and lights.
I mean, I must admit, I have seen the whole Max Get Smart thing probably about 4 times now. I share your concerns there, Andrew.
Exactly. So that there are issues about, certainly sleep time. We know that you shouldn't see any screen content, certainly up close, 2 hours before bed. But to get to the point of immersing them into screen time, this is the world they're now operating in. And what I tell a lot of parents is this: if we actually look at our day-to-day lives now of how often we're in front of a screen because of our jobs, we're actually spending more time in front of computers than we do in front of TVs. So in a way, we've indoctrinated them into how they view content. So then that brings the argument to, what is the content? Is the content really necessary? In the instance of the 3-year-old, it might have been good for 5 minutes, but if you put them on there for 5 hours, well, that's excessive. So really, we've got to start asking the question about what are they consuming. So if they were watching a cartoon, or it was a children's cartoon, and that was also in book form, are you able to supplant it? The truth is what they want is movement and action. And we've known that in child psychology for decades, that movement and action is far more engaging. So that's why screens are captivating to very young kids. We need to also differentiate by showing them books and involving them in those as well.
This is from a texter, and I know for a fact that this texter would be a few years advanced from 3, but the addiction is still just as profound. This the text goes, I need to sort some boundaries. I'm interested to hear what Andrew thinks when it comes to putting processes in action and to stop my dependence on tablets and phones. What a couple of really simple steps that people can do to start changing their habits?
Absolutely. The first thing is declutter your tech. And decluttering means look at the apps you've got on your tablet or your phone. How many do you have? How many do you access? How many are just chewing up space? Get rid of the ones you truly do not access more than once a week. And honestly, you probably wouldn't even miss them. Then when you do go for your phone, particularly when we're checking, and you mentioned that earlier on, that, how many times do you check your phone? We actually know it's the average Australian checks their phone 85 times a day.
Wow.
And of that, only 30% is actually to do something. The rest of it is just wasting time. So declutter your phone from things that would distract you. Leave the apps that are actually useful for bit of leisure time, bit of work time, whatever you need to do. And then start supplanting. Start looking at what did I normally do before this? And now we're actually in a generation where a lot of people probably haven't thought of what they do before.
Struggling to recall.
But this is where screen time comes in. Look at quality screen time. Reading. So Kindles and Kobos and things like that, they're fantastic. You're still engaged in reading. If you have to do emails, sure, but to be honest, that's actually working your brain really hard and you don't get to switch off from work. So if you don't get to do these things, the third thing I'd actually mention is put a mindfulness app on your phone. Start listening to mindfulness and getting you to live in the moment and starting to breathe and meditate. This is the things that actually de-stresses us and actually makes our brains work a lot better when we do have to engage with multifaceted tasks between technology.
There was an excellent article that was in The Guardian recently looking at all these various circuit breaking and mindfulness apps, including Moment, which was one that was looked at length. This idea of keeping your phone reliance tabulated and reduced to cold, hard figures. Have you yourself tried these, Andrew, as in a means of changing your own behaviour?
I definitely have, yes. And to be honest, it really works. But I liken this to starting a diet program. So you set yourself a goal to lose 10 kilos, you hit that mark, and then what do? You start snacking.
Yeah, you reward yourself for your fine work.
Yourself. We do the same thing with our tech. We go, all right, I'm going to reduce all my clutter. I'm going to watch my time. I'm going to be mindful of when I pick it up and I'm wasting time. And you start seeing the behavior change. And typically it happens within 3 weeks. About 21 days in, you start noticing that your behavior really has changed. But then something new happens in the technology world. Some new app, some new game, some new social media, and you get hooked on that thing. And it brings you back to then cluttering your tech, spending more time online. We have to stick to our goals. That's the main thing, and not be distracted by them.
How do we know the impacts that it has on our mental health, and what are the kind of research figures and papers coming through at the moment, Andrew?
There's a tremendous
our sort of mental well-being.
Look, in Australia, if we look at the Australian population, we are tech lovers. We're huge tech lovers, and we're fast tech adapters when it comes to phones. In fact, when we look at the new phone lines coming out, we're one of the boom countries. So when we look at that, we seem to think that having technology is a big part of it. So on one of the mental health aspects that we've seen is keeping up stress. Our stress levels in technology are very, very high. You may have spoken about this before on your program about fear of missing out, FOMO.
Yes.
That is the biggest
proponent. And a bit of JOMO too.
And a bit of JOMO, exactly. Yeah, the joy of missing out. Look, the truth of the matter is we have to evaluate how much FOMO we really need in our lives versus JOMO. Because
the itchy and scratchy of the digital world.
Itchy and scratchy, yeah. Because in all honesty, our stress levels of being connected 24/7 are through the roof. We're not giving our brain a full holiday. We tried these things called digital detoxes, and they've been around for a long time. But the truth is it's like the diet. You can start it, but you've got to stick to it. Otherwise, it's not going to have a great deal of benefit. So the second thing we're noticing is that young people are feeling that they are actually not going to be liked or have social acceptance without being connected. And that's another thing that we're seeing in the literature that's really scary. We want to have positive connections, not massive connections, if that makes sense.
What about the idea of the ethics within design of apps and design of platforms, that idea of the app creator or the service provider reminding users about their own mental health, about their own addictive, potentially addictive customs.
Yeah, look, there's many companies that turned a blind eye to this for quite some years, in fact decades, and only in the last 2 years we're starting to see some social responsibility come from major companies. But having said that, there is actually a technical gap here, and that is that they're designing things without making sure they work. So
What's an example? Can we look at one of these?
Yeah, well, actually, you mentioned it before. If we've got a company that says we're going to monitor your phone and we're going to switch it off at certain times, or you can predetermine switching it off, there's ways people override it. And actually, the most well-known one that was published was anything to do with exercise apps that says, I'm going to remind you to stretch now. After a while, people just go, oh, just shut up. I don't want to hear it. So we've got this disconnect between the technology makers and human behavior experts not meeting in the middle with user participants saying, this is really going to work if we use these three structures together. What we've got is engineers who are saying, we think this will work, we'll put it out there, see what happens. And that's where it's falling down.
What about the idea of we're sort of demonising social media pretty readily here. You did mention that older people will recognise friends for exactly that rather than the sort of affirmation of strangers. But I mean, surely there are some real benefits to technology and our own mental health. How do we separate the angel from the devil?
Look, I couldn't agree with that statement more. In fact, the premise of psychology or any science is to take a neutral point of view and see where the science leads us. In the early days of the internet, there was a lot of claims that it causes depression. We've actually debunked that. We found it does not cause depression, but it can actually add to depressive symptoms if they're already present. So coming to the positive side now, we now know that social media, and if I can use that one again, is actually very positive for mental health, incredibly positive for mental health if done the right way. Sydney Uni's leading a study in the Cyberpsychology Group right now with Kids Helpline, where we're trialling the first purpose-built social media mental health platform. What it does is group counselling for kids in an anonymous, safe environment where you can track the kids, they can interact and talk about their problems, whether it be bullying, depression, abuse in the home, and seek help in the group, but also get support from those who are going through lived experience. So this is a pretty amazing thing we're just about to publish on.
And that's for people to access these chat rooms. It's through the cyberpsychology site there at the university?
Look, if they're interested in participating, it's actually good to go to the Kids Helpline website and look up Kids Helpline circles, and they can participate in that. It's fantastic. It's open to kids 13 to 25. Now, I know a 25-year-old's not a kid, but we included adolescents because there's a lot of university TAFE students, new workers, people moving away from home, and they are a huge group of people that feel like, well, I'm isolated wherever I am. People aren't going through the same things I am. I'd like to meet them, but I don't want to reveal who I am. And I'd like it to be monitored so that I know that I'm safe. And so there's counsellors that monitor it 24/7 through Kids Helpline.
Last question, Andrew, and that is the idea of you. I know you've been involved in this area of a specific area of mental health, looking at how technology interacts and interfaces with mental health. What's the biggest change in the last year in terms of the challenge of social media and tablet use?
I think if I take one positive and one negative, the positive is that young people genuinely want to use it for good. When we look at cyberbullying and trolling, while they are still there and they are still a big problem, we actually notice that it's transitional and that we're noticing that people are realizing this is not appropriate behavior. So they're trying to look at it for social change, for mental health, education and growth, and jobs. So we're seeing real new use in a positive sense for the younger users. One of the negatives, though, and that we're still challenged by, is suicide. Social media and having people reach out on social media and not get the help that they need, and leaving suicide notes or actually pushing people to suicide through the cyberbullying on the very dark end, that's still something that is a huge challenge. And the eHealth Commissioner is doing, I think, a stellar job trying to tackle this.
On that sobering note, Andrew, we thank you for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation. I look forward to having future chats about this vast area and, in fact, a very a dynamic area as well.
Oh, thank you very much.
Dr. Andrew Campbell, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Sydney. And just on that issue of mental health, if you are troubled by that conversation or distressed in any way, Lifeline 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue 1300 22 4636. And the address that Andrew mentioned is kidshelpline.com.au.